The prairie wind had a way of making a man feel hollow. Elias McCord had grown used to it, the endless hush of grass, the timber shack creaking in its joints, the orchard of half-dead trees rattling their bones against the sky. Years had passed in that silence, years since the mound on the hill had claimed his wife, and the neighbors had stopped riding out. He spoke now only to his horse, or to the kettle when it whistled too loud. That evening, the light bled thin and red across the plains, storm clouds gathering on the horizon like bruises. Elias was shutting the corral gate when he saw her, collapsed in the dirt, as if dropped from the sky itself. A girl, no more than 16, barefoot, her dress torn in strips, blood matting one of her braids. She looked at him without a sound, her eyes wide and sharp, distrust brimming in their depths. For a long moment Elias stood still, his hand resting on the gate latch, the air tightening around him. He knew well enough what this could mean. A Comanche girl on his land was no small matter. Behind her might ride a war party. Behind her might ride his death. Yet the prairie night was already rising cold, and her lips were cracked with thirst. To leave her out there was worse than murder. He stooped, lifted her lightly as one would lift a wounded fawn, and carried her to the cabin. She was thin, her weight hardly more than the saddle blanket on his mare. She did not fight, only fixed her eyes on him as though trying to measure the shape of his soul. Inside, he laid her near the fire, stoked the embers till they flared, and set a pan of beans and coffee to warming. The room filled with the smell of smoke and blackened tin. He placed the food before her, but she did not touch it. She sat rigid on the floor, her bare feet tucked beneath her, eyes darting to the rifle above the mantel, then back to him. Elias lowered himself into his wife's rocking chair, the wood groaning under him. He did not press her to eat. He did not speak. He had forgotten how to, in truth, unless words were needed for the weather or the soil. The only sound was the fire licking the logs, and the chair's creak as he rocked. The shadows stretched long as the night deepened. Outside, the wind carried the faint cry of coyotes, sharp against the silence. Inside, the girl's breathing steadied, though her eyes never closed. Elias felt the weight of his own loneliness shifting inside him, as if the years of silence had cracked to make room for something else, something more complicated, edged with risk. Widowhood had taught him that loss could strip a man hollow, but now, watching the girl's thin shoulders tremble in firelight, he wondered if there were souls more abandoned than his own. He leaned back, letting the chair settle in its slow rhythm, and kept watch through the long hours, until the first pale grey of dawn seeped through the cracks of the shuttered window. The morning came pale and slow, seeping through the shutters in thin grey lines that fell across the cabin floor. Elias rose stiffly from the chair where he had dozed in fits, the embers still alive with a faint glow. The girl had not moved far. She sat against the wall near the hearth, her chin on her knees, watching him as though she had not closed her eyes all night. In daylight her injuries showed clear. Scratches traced her arms, bruises bloomed dark against her skin, and when she shifted, her right ankle gave beneath her weight. Elias crouched near her, careful not to startle, and gestured for her to show him the foot. She hesitated, distrust clouding her gaze, but at last she extended it toward him. He touched gently, the way he would with a lame colt, and she flinched at first before settling. The joint was swollen, tender to the bone. He bound it with a strip of cloth torn from an old work shirt, his hands rough yet steady. As he worked, memory pressed against him. The last time he had opened his door to someone in need, his late wife's cousin riding in from Missouri, lean and hungry, had ended with half his savings gone and his trust along with it. Since then he had kept his door bolted, his hearth his own. And yet, here he was again, binding the ankle of a stranger who could bring ruin upon him without a word. She made a sound then, soft and halting, shaping syllables that carried little meaning to his ear. But one word she repeated until he understood, Iona. He nodded, saying it once aloud, and her eyes flickered with the smallest spark, as if the name had tethered her presence in this house. Through the day she limped slowly around the single room, touching things with a wary curiosity. Her fingers lingered on the rocking chair where his wife's shawl still lay, frayed but folded neat. She drew the fabric between her hands, lifting it to her cheek. Elias watched from the doorway, his throat thick, memories stirring like dust under old floorboards. Later she knelt near the bed frame, drawn to the box he kept there. The lid had not been lifted in years. When she traced the edge with her hand, Elias spoke sharply, and she recoiled. But he sighed, lowered himself, and opened it. Inside lay the wedding dress, yellowed with time, lace brittle as leaves in autumn. Iona's gaze softened. She did not touch it, only bowed her head as if recognizing a sacred relic. Elias felt his grief settle heavy again, though not as sharp as before. It was as though this girl, who had lost something of her own, understood the language of absence without words. When he returned to the ankle that evening, he noticed something he had overlooked. One of her braids ended blunt, cut short. He remembered enough from traders' talk to know the meaning. Mourning. The cut braid marked her loss, as his orchard of dying trees marked his. They ate little, neither speaking much. The stew Elias set before her she tasted at last, a small gesture that eased the silence. As dusk fell, the wind shifted colder, carrying the long mournful cry of wolves over the frozen hills. Elias sat in the rocking chair, the rhythm steadying his bones, while Iona curled small near the fire, wrapped in his old wool blanket. The room held no laughter, no ease, only a quiet that seemed less empty than before. Elias stared at the flames and wondered, not for the first time, if by bringing her inside he had not invited more than wolves to his doorstep. The wind rose first as a low moan across the plains, the kind Elias knew would turn before long into something sharper. By afternoon, the sky to the north had bruised dark, and the air carried the bite of sleet. He stacked wood against the cabin wall, his breath showing white in the cold, and cast a glance at the girl watching him from the doorway. Her hair whipped loose from its braid, her blanket drawn tight around her shoulders, eyes never still. By nightfall the storm had taken the land entire. Wind battered the shutters like fists, and sleet rattled against the roof with a noise that seemed unending. Inside, the fire spat and hissed, smoke curling into the rafters. Elias set about his chores, splitting kindling by lantern light, hammering a wedge into the beam that had begun to leak, tightening the latch on the rattling door. Every move he made, he felt her gaze on him, steady as a hawk's. When he lowered himself into the chair again, thunder cracked over the plains, the sound rolling long and deep. Iona sat near the fire, her thin form folded small, but when the lightning lit the room, he saw her eyes wide open, fixed on the floorboards as though she saw something else there. Later, in sleep, she shifted restless, her breath quickening, hands clenching the blanket. Once she cried out, a sound too sharp to be a dream of nothing. Elias watched, the storm's howl mingling with her broken breaths, and felt the weight of questions he could not ask. Toward dawn, when the gale seemed to reach its fiercest, he brewed coffee thick and black, pouring 2 cups though he knew she would refuse. He placed one on the hearth beside her hand without speaking. At first she ignored it, her face turned toward the storm-beaten window. But after a long while she lifted the tin cup and drank. The small act tightened something in Elias's chest. Their silence had shifted, no longer brittle, but carrying the faint outline of trust. It was then she looked toward the rifle above the mantel. Her lips shaped a word he could not catch, soft but urgent. She said it again, her dark eyes fixed on him, then at the gun, then at the storm. He did not need the tongue to know her meaning. The storm that pressed against his walls was not the only one bearing down upon them. Elias leaned back, the chair groaning under him, listening to the roof creak and the wind scream through the chinks. He understood now she had not stumbled here by accident. Something followed her across the prairie, and it would not be turned aside by weather or distance. The storm outside was only its herald. The storm broke sometime in the night, leaving the land washed raw and clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. When Elias woke, the cabin was empty. Panic struck swift and sudden. His first thought was that she had slipped away, or worse, that she had led riders to his very door. He snatched the rifle down, boots crunching over damp floorboards, and threw the door wide to the pale morning. She was not gone. She was sitting on the hill where the lone cedar stood, her hands folded in her lap, her lips moving soundlessly. At the base of that cedar lay the stone he had set for his wife. Elias stood at the doorway a long moment, rifle heavy in his hands, unsure what he felt. The sight pierced him deeper than he expected, gratitude that she would show respect mingling with a sharper fear, that her presence at his wife's grave meant she had sunk roots here, roots that might cost him his life. He busied himself through the day, the way a man does when his mind will not rest. The whetstone sang against the blade of his axe. He fixed the fence the storm had broken. He carried the rifle slung across his shoulder wherever he walked, his eyes on the horizon. And each time he glanced back toward the house, he saw her moving quiet, barefoot in the mud, lending her hands. She fetched water from the creek in his dented bucket. She mended the frayed shawl with thread she found in his chest, her dark head bent low over the faded cloth. The cabin felt different with her in it, still silent, yet less hollow. A fragile alliance had taken root, though neither named it. Evening dropped heavy and still, the clouds breaking into strips of fire across the western sky. Elias sat sharpening a hoe in the doorway, the rasp of metal on stone keeping his nerves steady. Inside, the girl hummed softly to herself, a tune low and mournful. For a moment he allowed himself to believe perhaps the danger would pass them by, that the storm had carried it elsewhere. Then he heard it, the faint thrum of hoofbeats on wet ground. Distant, yet drawing nearer. He froze, stone in one hand, blade in the other, his ears straining. The girl stiffened where she sat by the fire, her head tilting as though she too had heard it long before he had. Her lips parted, shaping a word in a whisper. This time Elias understood. "Father." The sound of it rooted him to the floor, dread cutting sharp through his chest. He reached for the rifle, the stock familiar against his palm. He should feel anger, even betrayal, yet what came instead was a heavy clarity. Whatever rode toward him was bound to her, and by sheltering her he had bound himself as well. The hoofbeats carried on through the twilight, closer with each passing breath. Elias gripped the rifle, his heart torn between the old instinct to bar his door against the world and the new, stubborn duty that had begun to hold him fast to this girl with the cut braid and haunted eyes. Whatever came of it, he knew one truth clear as the coming night: he could not turn her away now. The hoofbeats that haunted the night became thunder by dawn. Elias stepped onto the porch with the rifle in his hands, the air cold against his face. Across the pale horizon, riders emerged in a dark line that stretched and swelled, 70 strong, their ponies moving as one. Sunlight caught on streaks of war paint, on the polished wood of lances, on faces as hard as carved stone. They fanned wide until the cabin stood encircled, his homestead caught like a bird in a snare. Inside, Iona stood at the window. Her lips trembled though no sound left them, her eyes wet with something that looked like fear and relief bound together. Elias could not say which cut him deeper, that she longed for them, or that she dreaded them. He laid the rifle on the table, steadying his hands against the wood. His eyes strayed, unbidden, to the chest beneath the bed, to the folded wedding dress yellowed with years. He remembered the day he placed it there, when the soil on the hill was still fresh, when the rocking chair first became his only companion. That weight pressed against him now, as heavy as the ring still hidden in his drawer, as heavy as the silence that had ruled his years. The riders pulled their circle tighter, hooves drumming, until one broke forward. He dismounted with the slowness of a man who knew all eyes followed him. His shoulders were broad, his hair braided and streaked with grey, his bearing that of command. The girl whispered the word again, "Father," and Elias felt his chest clench. The air held still, though the horses shifted, snorting mist into the morning. No words crossed between them at first. Only silence, deep as a canyon, filled with meaning Elias could not reach. The chief's eyes studied him the way a hawk studies prey, sharp and unblinking, measuring the truth of a man's soul. Elias did not lift his rifle. He stood with his hands open, his breath steady though his heart beat against his ribs like a drum. It was Iona who broke the spell. She stepped past Elias, her limp pronounced but her head high. In her hand she carried two small things, the coffee tin Elias had left for her, and the severed braid that marked her mourning. She knelt in the dirt between her father and the man who had sheltered her, placing both offerings on the ground. One spoke of her grief, the other of the strange shelter she had found beneath this roof. The chief's gaze lowered to those tokens, then rose back to Elias. For a long moment nothing moved. Then the old man stepped forward, crouched, and touched the tin with a finger as though testing its weight. His eyes softened, if only a fraction. Tension bled slowly from the circle. A hand lowered from a bowstring. A lance tipped toward the earth. The chief straightened and spoke, words Elias could not understand, but the tone carried something less like judgment and more like recognition. That night, a fire was lit between the cabin and the riders. Men sat in silence, the flames painting their faces in red and gold. Elias sat across from the chief, bread and salt laid between them. They did not share language, but they broke the bread together, and it was enough. The fire popped and hissed, the stars shone wide above, and for the first time in years, Elias felt that his home was not only his own burden, but a place where mercy had taken root. No blood had been spilled. The world had tilted, not toward violence, but toward an uneasy peace forged not by words, nor by rifles, but by the quiet dignity of men who chose restraint when steel was near to hand. The night passed without a blade drawn. The riders kept their watch beyond the firelight, horses shifting in the dark, while Elias sat across from the chief in silence. No words could bridge their distance, yet something heavier than words passed between them, an unspoken measure of who each man was. When dawn at last thinned the sky, grey turning to pale gold, the decision was made without ceremony. Iona would ride with her people again. Her father had not come to kill, but to reclaim. The girl limped to her pony with help from a brother whose face bore the same sharp lines as hers. She mounted slow, her eyes lowered, But when the reins were placed in her hands, she lifted her head and looked back at Elias. He stood at the cabin door, rifle hanging unused at his side, the light washing his face. She gave him no word, no gesture, only a look, gratitude, sorrow, and the faintest spark of trust, like a flame catching in damp tinder. Her short, uneven braid lay against her shoulder, still marked by loss, yet her survival made it more than mourning. It had become a sign of beginning again. The riders wheeled their circle wide, the sound of hooves rolling across the prairie like a river of thunder. Elias watched them vanish into the horizon's haze, his land falling silent once more. But the silence was changed. It no longer pressed like a stone against his chest. He walked the orchard later, the branches twisted and half dead, snow still clinging in the shadows of the roots. Yet as the sun grew warmer, drops of water fell steady from the limbs, soaking into thawing ground. He touched one branch, brittle under his palm, and thought of how trees endure storms, scarred but alive, waiting for spring. By evening, he returned to the cabin and lowered himself into the rocking chair that had carried so much of his solitude. The shawl his wife once wore lay across his lap, worn soft with years. For the first time, he whispered a prayer not bound to grief but to release. Not asking for what he had lost, but giving thanks for what he had been allowed to give. The chair rocked slow, firelight flickering across the room, shadows playing on the walls. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and quiet, the world unchanged yet altered in him. Somewhere beyond those rolling hills, a girl with a cut braid rode homeward because he had chosen mercy over fear. The silence of his homestead was no longer a grave, but a kind of soil, emptiness that could yet grow. And though he remained alone, he felt in his chest the first stirrings of something he had thought long buried, the possibility of peace.